Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. I'm searching underneath the floorboards for the source of a most troublesome sound. Perhaps you've heard it. It's a low, dull, quick sound, almost like that made by a watch when enveloped in cotton. It's the beating of the old man's heart. Oh, never mind. I found it. Well, if you'd like to join me in my search for the origins of Poe's classic terror tale, The Telltale Heart, why don't you join me down here in tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. This is Edgar Allan Poe's boyhood bed from the Poe Museum. One of his classmates and lifelong friends, John Hamilton Mackenzie, said that one of Poe's greatest fears growing up was that when he was lying asleep in this bed, he imagined that someone out there, somewhere in the shadows, was watching him as he slept, that he would open his eyes to see a face staring back at him from the darkness. Decades later, those early childhood fears formed the basis of his classic terror tale, The Telltale Heart, the story of a little old man alone in bed at night who's being stalked by a killer. It's also the story of that murderer who assures us that he's not mad, that what you mistake for madness is merely an over-acuteness of the senses. As he says, the disease has sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled. Above all things was the sense of hearing acute. Oh, I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. Most of Poe's story takes place in total darkness, where the narrator, the murderer, hears strange sounds that are eerily reminiscent of the beating of a human heart. For instance, he describes listening to the death watches in the walls, tiny beetles that make a ticking sound, kind of like this. Then he describes hearing another sound, a low, dull, quick sound, almost like that made by a watch when enveloped in cotton. Maybe even this one. This is the watch that was in Edgar Allan Poe's pocket while he wrote The Telltale Heart. Maybe even wrapped it up in cotton to hear how it sounded, or placed it in front of him on his writing desk for inspiration. Now, the murderer in the story believes that slight ticking sound is the beating of the old man's heart that he hears all the way across the room. And this murderer, after all, has supersonic hearing. He can hear all things in the heavens and in the earth. So why not the old man's heart? So this watch bore witness to the creation of one of the greatest horror stories of all time. Poe probably bought it in 1841 or 1842 during a brief period of prosperity while he's employed at Graham's Magazine in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, he left the magazine in April of 1842 because he wanted to start his own magazine, which didn't work. And you pile on top of that the fact that his wife came down with tuberculosis. He was struggling to make a living. Almost even considered giving up journalism altogether to find a cushy job in Washington, D.C. Can you imagine Poe becoming a Washington bureaucrat or maybe even a politician? By November of that year, he was on the verge of declaring bankruptcy when he sat down to work on this story. There's a few inspirations that probably came to mind. One was a murder trial he covered for Alexander's Weekly Messenger. A man named James Wood had remorselessly murdered his entire family, and now he is claiming in court that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. In addition to this, Poe is also fascinated with another story you might have heard. From Salem, Massachusetts in 1830, a man named Richard Crownshield Jr. robbed and killed a little old man named Joseph White in his bed in the middle of the night and slipped out through the window. Poe might have heard of this case because Daniel Webster wrote about it. And he described how the murderer, after the deed was done, checked carefully the pulse of his victim. Then he ducked out the window, leaving not a trace of his presence there. Probably assured that he would never get caught, that his secret would follow him to the grave. But as Webster wrote, the secret which the murderer possesses soon comes to possess him. And like the evil spirits of which we read, it overcomes him and leads him whithersoever it will. He feels it beating at his heart, rising to his throat and demanding disclosure. He thinks the whole world sees it in his face, reads it in his eyes, and almost hears its workings in the very silence of his thoughts. It has become his master. It must be confessed. It will be confessed. Does that sound familiar to you? The murderer in Poe's story kills the old man, carefully dismembers the body, placing the pieces under the floorboard so carefully that no human eye could detect anything wrong. He thinks he's gotten away with his crime. Even after police who've been dispatched because a neighbor heard the old man scream in the night searched the house, he feels assured that he's gotten away with it. He shows them the old man's treasures undisturbed. He says that the scream had been his own after a nightmare. He tells them the old man he's on vacation. And he would have gotten away with it until he started hearing that low, dull, quick sound. That ticking, almost like the sound of a watch when enveloped in cotton, which he is convinced is the beating of the old man's heart even after death from beneath the floorboards. Well, was it the old man's heart? Or the killer's guilty conscience? Or maybe the beating of Poe's watch? Poe submitted the Telltale Heart to the Boston Miscellany, which promptly rejected it. They said it was too loud. So his friend James Russell Lowell agreed to publish it for $10 in his new magazine, The Pioneer, right here. Unfortunately, $10 was not enough to pay off all of Poe's debts. So just before the publication of what would become one of his most famous stories, he filed for bankruptcy. And right at the top of the list of his creditors is John Albright of Philadelphia, a tailor who Poe owed $180. A lot of money back then. Poe had no chance of paying it off with the $10 he got for the story, so he gave him this watch, which at the time would have been worth about $100 to $150. It's a fine gold piece made in France. And if you look on the inside here, right there, Poe's name is engraved right on the inside. The watch's ownership descended through several different members of the Albright family before going into the collection of a rare watch collector. In the 1930s, the owner at the time actually tried to sell it to the Poe Museum. Of course, the Poe Museum couldn't begin to afford it because it was the Great Depression, after all. It went through several more owners over the years, making the news occasionally from time to time because it was Edgar Allan Poe's watch. Until finally, Susan Jaffe Teen bought it at auction, and she decided to donate it to the Poe Museum in honor of the museum's centennial this year. And it'll go on display on April 28th of 2022 for the very first time. Maybe if you're here, if you listen very carefully, you can even hear it ticking. Or maybe that's just the beating of the old man's heart. Thanks for joining us. And if you'd like to see more videos like this before anyone else has a chance to see them, why not support the Poe Museum by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Poe Museum. Until next time, I leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats.